I'm going to show you how to use the Wating Timer schema element. Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing. We're just about to talk about how to use the Wating Timer schema element. But don't forget, there's a playlist up there in the upper right-hand corner that you can use to see the other videos in the series, because we don't just talk about Wating Timer, we talk about other ways of scheduling workflows, causing them to sleep, causing them to wait, and so forth. But here, in this video, we're going to talk about Wating Timer. That's a schema element. Here it is. This is the Wating Timer schema element. Now, in a previous video, we talked about another schema element called Schedule Workflow, which has something in common with Wating Timer. I'm going to show you what that is. In addition, I'm going to show you how to use the Wating Timer schema element over in the lab environment. Let's go there. As you can see, I'm already in the VRO client, and I'm going to go to Library, Workflows. And just briefly, I'd like to show you this workflow that we created in a previous video to show you something important. So we'll open up this older workflow, and you'll recall in this workflow that we used a schedule workflow. So here's our schedule workflow. And the point of the schedule workflow schema element is to call a specified workflow at some point in the future. So in this scheduled workflow, this is where we specify the workflow that we want scheduled, but up above there in the options section, we had this input called workflow schedule date. That was a date object. Now, that date object is going to show up again here in just a moment when I show you the Wating Timer schema element. So let's exit out of the editor and let's create a brand new workflow by clicking on New Workflow. Our new workflow is going to be called Waiting using Wating Timer. We'll click Create. And we do the usual things here. We'd set up our tags, we'd set up our description, but shortcutting it in this video, we're going to jump straight to the Schema tab. And unlike that previous video where we used a schedule workflow, this time we're going to use something else called the Wating Timer schema element. So let's drag a Wating Timer schema element into our workflow where we want the workflow to pause. So here with Wating Timer, let me make this pretty there we go. Here, if I select Wating Timer, over here on the right, we can see various fields. These are the usual sorts of fields. So if I wanted to change this label, I would change the name field here and so forth. But I'd like to jump straight to this input section. Wating Timer only has a single input, and as I was pointing out a few moments ago with that older workflow, it too requires that we pass in a date object. So this is going to be very similar to what we saw when we did a schedule workflow schema element. So we're going to need to set up this date object, and if you're looking really closely here, you'll notice a couple things that are different from schedule workflow. Wating Timer requires us to pass in a date object, but it has no output. On the other hand, schedule workflow had an output of a Orchestrator task object. And furthermore, with Wating Timer, we're not scheduling a workflow, so there's nothing here about picking a workflow. We're not scheduling a workflow, we're just causing the workflow we're writing to pause until a future time and date. That's different from in the previous video. In the previous two videos, I showed you how to sleep for a certain amount of time. So we could have, in the previous videos, we could specify in milliseconds or seconds how long we wanted to sleep. But that's not quite how Wating Timer works. Wating Timer works by specifying a time and date in the future. So let's see how this works. In order to use Wating Timer, I need to bind to Wating Timer's variable called timer.date. Now I can do that either by going to the Variables tab or the Inputs tab to create a new variable or input of type date, or if I want to shortcut it here, I can just click on select variable, and create new. Either way, I need to create a new variable and bind it to the waiting timers variable called timer.date. So I'm going to say create new, and to allow the user who's calling my workflow to specify the future time and date that we want our workflow to resume, I'll create an input. On the other hand, if I, the Orchestrator developer, wanted to specify a time and date in the future, I would choose create a variable, formerly known as an attribute. I'm going to go ahead and use the default name for this input, and I'll type a description here. So let's see, in this case here, this is the time and date at which we want our workflow, this workflow, not some other workflow we're calling, but the time and date we want this workflow to resume. It has to be the same type as the input to waiting timer schema element, so I'm just going to leave the rest of this alone and simply click create. Now there's nothing else that I need to set up here. I do need to save this workflow, and as good practice I should validate the workflow. So it looks like it's ready to run. Let's go ahead and run the workflow, and in this variable that we just set up, actually this input we set up, we'll set its value by clicking on this blank field here. We'll choose a date and time in the future. Let's choose today, February 13th. And then we need to specify the hour and minute at which we want this workflow to resume. I'm going to just bump this up a couple of minutes. So as you can see, I'm working late at night. Actually, it's just beyond midnight. I'm going to give it 2 minutes in the future. That's when I want the workflow to resume. So I'll click run. My workflow starts running, but notice this yellow highlighting indicates that the workflow is currently waiting. And if I recall correctly, I just said 2 minutes. So rather than make you wait, as I'm going to have to wait, we're going to do a little bit of video editing magic here, and we'll resume in a few moments. And as you can see, the workflow has automatically started running. Why? Because the timer that I specified in my date object, we've reached the time that was specified in the date object, so the workflow automatically resumed. And now my workflow is done. But we've seen now how to use waiting timer. Now there's one other thing that you need to know about waiting timer, and by the way, I mentioned this in the previous video when we were talking about the schedule workflow schema element. And that's that whenever you're working with these date objects, instead of just asking the user to use the date time picker to pick a date and time in the future, what you'll oftentimes need to do in a workflow such as this that's using a date object, what you'll oftentimes need to do is, instead of having some input like this one here that the user is going to use to specify a date and time in the future, instead what you'll do is drag into your workflow something such as a scriptable task. You'll position it somewhere before the waiting timer schema element. And in that scriptable task, what you'll do is type JavaScript code to perform date arithmetic. Now, that's not something that we're going to talk about just yet in this video, but if you keep watching in the next video or so, I will be talking about specifically about date arithmetic, and I'll show you an example. If you can't wait till that next video, then just go use the search engine, search for JavaScript tutorial date object arithmetic, and you can find examples of what I'm talking about. Join me in the next video where I'll show you how to use the schema element called Wating Event.